Welcome to Digging Deeper into Spiritual Practices, a Spiritual Seedlings interview with Nancy Flinchbaugh. I'm the author of several books, including Awakening, a contemplative primer on learning to sit. I want my readers to have opportunities to learn more about the spiritual practices discussed in my book. So I'm interviewing some contemplative experts. Today, I'm interviewing Reverend Sarah Anders, the spiritual leader of the Wild Earth Spiritual Community in DC. I will also be talking with Sarah about the practices of Lectio Divina with the earth. I think you'll enjoy this. Can you imagine worship where you listen to the earth for 20 minutes rather than listening to a sermon? Stay tuned to discover more.
Great. Hi, this is Nancy Flinchbaugh, and this is a Spiritual Seedlings interview with Sarah Anders. Sarah is a UCC pastor, and she is the co-founder and the leader of the Wild Earth Spiritual Community. And today I'm talking with Sarah about her experiences with Lectio Divina and also the Wild Church movement. So I think this is really exciting, and I'm looking forward to what Sarah has to say. I just want to start, Sarah, by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to be into this movement and this position as a pastor.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I was born and raised a Southern Baptist, and that means I got Jesus in my veins, coursing through my blood. I knew all of the Bible scriptures. You name it, I got it. And as I got older, I drifted away from that denomination for very obvious reasons. They were just really not anywhere near progressive enough. But then also I drifted away from religion in general for a long time. And once I had a family and children, I started thinking about finding a faith community. And I am married to a Jewish man, so we looked for a long time for a temple and a church where we could dual educate our children. And we found that to be a little bit too difficult. So we joined an organization in Washington, in the Washington area, called Interfaith Families Project. It was just getting off the ground floor in Tacoma Park, founded by 3 Catholic women, all married to Jewish men. We said, how are we going to do this? How are we going to raise our children? And so that was a great way for me to jump back into the religious river. And eventually I decided I did want them to get a little bit more than they were getting at Interfaith Families Project. And I found a very progressive UCC church in my neighborhood. And so then we started doing both, which was quite complicated and fun. But I really admire the UCC for their boldness in being first in so many things. And I like their independence, their autonomy. And so after a while, I decided to go back to school and get my master's in theology, and then decided that I was being called into ministry and got my master's of divinity. Worked in a couple of churches for a while and was ordained and realized that something was missing, and I was yearning for something more. And that something more was a place to be with other people where we can go more deeply into the spiritual journey outdoors, so that we could engage with earth and each other in an unmediated way, to discern wisdom and the wisdom of the Great Spirit. So I started reading about the Forest Church movement in Great Britain, and then discovered that there were some wild churches that were starting in this area, not in this area, in this country, and quit my work at a perfectly fine church, 10 minutes from my home, and said, I want to start a wild church, and so that's what I did. I have partnered in this with the Center for Spirituality and Nature with Beth Norcross, and you would probably really enjoy having her on as well. Beth started the Center for Spirituality and Nature to offer programs to people in the DC area, connecting them with nature and engaging them with the divine whispers that we find there. So we've worked together now. This is our 3rd year of having a wild church. In deference to all of the families that are interfaith, and out of respect to people who find the spiritual outdoors and don't relate to a place that is brick and mortar called church. We changed their name from Church of the Wild. In the last 6 months, we changed the name to Wild Earth Spiritual Community. And it's a mouthful, but we feel like it just right out of the gate states exactly who we are. So we're not exclusive to Christians.
Okay. Well, so you have had a real journey into the wild and into nature. And today we want to talk a little bit about Lectio Divina with nature. And I always like that UCC slogan, we believe God is still speaking.
Yes, yes.
And I guess, I think with Lectio Divina and nature, we say we believe God's speaking in nature. So I just was curious, how did you first encounter Lectio Divina with nature? How did they come upon that?
Well, I didn't encounter the very classic Lectio Divina in nature until I met Beth. I had done a Shalem program, Shalem Institute program, and had studied, I knew Lectio Divina. I had done it in churches, I had done it with scripture, but I hadn't done it with nature. And Beth had written a pamphlet, a little book called Inside Out. And it's an ebook, you can get it online. And in it, she had an exercise of Lectio Divina in nature, where she offered a couple of quotes and maybe a poem, and suggested that to use in a retreat, hand those to people and ask them to go out into the nature and reflect upon what was being said to them through the words and the surroundings. So boy, once I got into that, just the whole idea of listening to nature, and just the recognition that I knew it, but someone was now saying it, that nature and earth is speaking all the time. It's intentional, it's expressive, it's vitally alive. It has its own language. I just was enthralled with it.
You started to incorporate that into your own spiritual practice then at that point, and listening.
Yeah. And offering Lectio Divina with in nature on retreats, women's retreats, and just other church special events. Yeah.
What suggestions would you give to somebody that might want to incorporate that into their spiritual life?
Well, I think there's a challenge inherent in Lectio Divina, and at this point, I've changed on this. I'll tell you frankly. I would invite people to be as open as they can to keeping their heads empty so that they don't go immediately into nature and begin identifying things and, you know, looking up everything one needs to know about a black-eyed Susan, because we're missing what it's saying. What I would suggest is that if someone is already engaged in spiritual practices and is already pretty immersed in quieting the self and quieting the mind, to allow oneself to just wander and see what is flirting with them. You know, in Lectio Divina, we say, what is shimmering? You know, what word is shimmering? I think that's Tilden Edwards' word. You know, how sometimes you feel like something's tapping you on the shoulder and you know, don't pay any attention. But to be really paying attention to that tap and that nudge, and let yourself go with that without judgment, without identification, and with a great sense of wonder and curiosity. So that and if it's difficult, I find one thing that's helpful is to just imagine that you're having a conversation with a tree, or you're having a conversation with a worm, or a spider. And that might be enough to just get you started. And again, you have to be careful with the words that are and the concepts that are filling your heads and taking you away from other ways of learning. But just for fun, just imagine having a conversation and what that stone or that river might be saying to you.
That's really nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you've done Lectio Divina with other things other than nature also, right? You like to do it with poetry or?
Yes, I've been leading a meditation and reflection group with poetry during the pandemic. And I do a very, an adapted version of classic Lectio Divina. I will read it first. I'll do a guided meditation, and then do a first reading, just allowing people to let the poem wash over them, and they can soak themselves in the poem. And then the second time, I'm going to have a few minutes of silence, and then the second time I read it and ask them to listen for that word or phrase that shimmers. That can be really subtle. Sometimes people wait for something to jump out at them, but it can be so subtle. And I think crucial to that step is to not immediately go to, what does that mean? It can take a long time for the meaning to emerge. And it might be a week later through a dream that you have. Or through a thought that you have in the shower, or it may just be something that comes to you. So I try to be careful with that, paying attention, that step, paying attention to a word, because I'm so afraid that people just clump onto that and start analyzing it, and this is what it means. And one of the things that happens then is we lose our sense that when we're more open and engaged and present, we lose that sense of nonlinear time, and we move back into linear time. And once we go there, you know, the whole thing's gone off the rails. But so So I encourage on that second reading for people to just, if there's some subtle little oomph to a word or a phrase, to pay attention to it for, not just that night, but for the next week or two. How does that resonate within you, and how do you discern that? The third reading, then, typically I ask for what the invitation is, what the holy might be inviting you to through these words, through this poem. So that is another way I've used it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've attended your Thursday night online sessions, and they're really, really nice. I really have enjoyed connecting.
I've enjoyed having you there too. Yeah.
So you also are part of the Wild Church movement, and I had never heard about that until I met you. And so I just want you to tell us a little bit about that. What is the Wild Church movement?
The Wild Church movement has only been around for maybe 4 or 5 years. It has become much more established now. There are wild churches all over the country and in Canada. And there are all different stripes, all denominations and no denominations. But they essentially are people who yearn to experience the divine in nature. That is where they find God. And that is where they want to go with others who likewise find God in nature and be with them and explore together. We had our very first, it was just so wonderful, our very first Wild Church Network leader conference. It was really just gathering in Wisconsin in March of last year. And of course, we had to cancel it this year, but this is a movement that is growing and growing.
So tell us about the Wild Church that you helped co-found. What's your church like?
Yeah, our Wild Earth Spiritual Community is now, we're meeting twice a month on Sunday afternoons in an area around the Metro DC, a park in Metro DC. We gather in a contemplative manner. It is not regular church outside. Some of the wild churches are, but ours is not. We are purposefully a contemplative gathering, so we'll begin with drumming or maybe chanting. We sit in a circle. We have usually a poem that is read, not typically something from the Hebrew Bible, but a poem having to do with nature and spirit. We sing together, and we have what is called a note from nature, which is when Beth Norcross, who I was speaking of earlier at the Center for Spirituality in Nature, takes a look at what is happening on the ground around us at that time. So, for instance, if there are buds just starting to appear, she'll talk a little bit about that. And then connect it to our overall theme, which may have to do with, what can we learn with the long, patient budding of a samsara or something. There is no sermon, because our sermon is a 20-minute silent walk. So I lead us in a guided meditation and a brief spiritual reflection on the theme, and then off everyone goes, and they scatter off to the woods. We met once, Nancy, In the pouring rain, it was not dangerous. There was no thunder or lightning. We had a tarp up, and we were all sitting huddled together. And I thought, boy, I'm going to say it's time to walk. You know, now go. I thought, no one's going out in this. No one. Every single person got up and scattered and walked in the rain. It was wonderful, but it's a silent walk. And that is, you know, as much as I could describe Lectio Divina in nature. We typically give, you know, some guidance for what they might do, which might be have a conversation with, you know, that mushroom you just saw. Or it might be something as simple as walk very slowly, aware of every contact, every bit of contact as your heel hits the ground and your foot rolls on up off the ground. Different things like that. When we come back, after usually 20 to 25 minutes, we'll drum people back in. And we have what we call the community sermon. And it is 5 words for people to describe their experience in 5 words. And it is astonishing what people say and how poetic and beautiful it is. But we try our best. We do that so people don't come back from this contemplative walk and just jump into chitter chatter. You know, well, I saw this, and but we try to just coalesce, you know, their experience into these 5 words, and it works. It works well. It works actually very well. Then we usually sing and have refreshments afterward, and hang out. And then people just, you know, what social hour is like after church. That's when it's like everyone's just.
That sounds wonderful.
It is. It is.
Wow. So now you're also involved with the Center for Spirituality and Nature. Is that connected to the Wild Church, or how is that?
Yeah, Center for Spirituality and Nature, Beth's organization, and really gave us the organizational framework so we could begin. They're a 501c3, so we were able to, you know, be covered in that way. They took care of our finances. They take care of our finances. They roll out the Eventbrites, the registrations, just incredibly helpful. And Beth runs programs. She just had a weekend camping trip in Michaud State Forest in Pennsylvania with 8 women. I think there were 9 altogether. And it was led by Beth and also someone who is a forest bathing facilitator. So they offer programs throughout the year. And this is the logo, Center for Spirituality and Nature. And this is a book that they have published, but there's an ebook. First of all, there's this Start Singing, and that's a sing group, Spirituality in Nature group. And it talks about how to start a sing group in your church. It's got all sorts of different ideas. It has a 12-month theme with suggestions on how to do it. And then she also has Inside Out, and these are practices for spiritual practices in nature. So it's worth checking out. So, you know, the Wild Earth Spiritual Community exists really as a community. We're in relationship with one another. This center acts more as with programs. And yeah.
So they're reaching out to a broader group of people that are interested in these types of experiences and
I think
retreats.
Yes, yes. They offer programs, one-off programs. For instance, there might be something on the wildflowers at Turkey Run. And so Beth will do what is pretty much a naturalist walk with a big spiritual component. So.
Wow, so you're just, the Lectio Divina has taken on a whole life of its own to go out and interact with nature. And I find it's just powerful. It's just refreshing usually to be in nature. And I do learn a lot, but then I also think there's a lot of suffering that's going on right now within nature. And I wonder, how do you deal with that? I'm wondering if there's a wild church in California or Oregon right now, and how are they dealing with the devastation of the fires? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, there are a number of wild churches on the West Coast. You mentioned Joanna Macy when we were chatting before we started. I've done facilitator training for the work that reconnects and am a facilitator for that. And of course, her spiral that she talks about in the work from that reconnects begins with gratitude and then moves into the honoring our pain. And that to me is so incredibly important, that we speak the pain, that there's a lot of talk now about spiritual bypassing, and I think that's a real thing, that people are moving beyond, not acknowledging the pain and the suffering that they're feeling, which they might as well do because it's there.
Yeah.
And get into, a more pie in the sky kind of spiritual perspective. And so I think your question is absolutely apt and appropriate. Some of the best work we've done in Wild Earth, and I know other wild churches have as well, has been around darkness. And that, that we must acknowledge darkness, and that's the only way we can come out of it to see with new eyes. Otherwise, we're just not in reality.
Yeah, I know, like my contemplative practice, as I started to meditate and slow down, I think you become in better touch with the earth. And then as you become in touch with the earth, I think it's impossible not to be awakened to what's happening to the earth and the cry of the earth. I read that book edited by Llewellyn Vaughan Lee.
Yes.
The Spiritual Ecology, the Cry of the Earth, in which, yes, from all the major religious traditions, they all talk about how the earth is crying out.
Yes.
And I don't think if I had never started a meditation practice, I'm not sure that I would have slowed down enough. But I do think the pandemic is also slowing people down.
Yes.
They're listening to racism, and maybe they also will begin to understand that the crying of the earth, the pandemic, is a symptom of our climate changing. I don't know. It's just, I think the earth has some of its own answers too, if we listen.
Yes. Oh, yes. And I think that weeping with the earth is important for us to do. Joanna Macy has a number of exercises for dealing with this pain and this grief that we're feeling, and knowing that we still carry on, even with the pain.
Well, thank you. There's just so much more to learn, and I enjoyed talking with you, and I know, and probably anybody who's listening too will think, oh, I need to learn more about this. So you've introduced a lot of different things that are new to me today, and so I'm looking forward to learning about them, and I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me this evening. And put some information up for those who are listening so that they can get in contact with you and
Thank
your
you.
Wild Church or Wild Earth movement.
Yes.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. This was fun. Okay.
Yeah. So how old are your children now? Are they grown or?
Oh, they're grown. Let me stop. Okay, I did stop the recording.
This has been a Spiritual Seedlings interview with Reverend Sarah Anders. To find out more about the information discussed in this program, check out the Center for Spirituality in Nature website. Sarah is the co-founder and spiritual director of the Wild Earth Spiritual Community, where their members seek to live in deep connection with the divine, the earth, and each other. They gather in sacred natural areas in the Metro DC area, combining contemplative spiritual practices with songs, chants, drumming, silent wandering, and fellowship. If you would like to attend Sarah's Thursday night reflection and poetry offered by Zoom during the pandemic, you can email Sarah at Reverend Sarah Anders at the Center for Spirituality and Nature.org. You can also read more about the events and resources at the Center for Spirituality and Nature website. And you can find the two resources that Sarah mentioned, Start Singing, which is how to start a spirituality in nature group, and also Inside Out, practices for going deeper into nature. And you might find there's a wild church near you. Check out thewildchurchnetwork.org for more information. They are popping up all over the land like wild mushrooms after a spring rain. The wild church communities are responding to a call from deep within to change the way we relate to the natural world, moving, like Thomas Berry once said, from a collection of objects to a communion of subjects. And also Sarah mentioned Work That Reconnects, founded by Joanna Macy, which helps people discover and experience their innate connections with each other and the self-healing powers of the web of life, transforming despair and overwhelm into inspired collaborative action. This has been a Spiritual Seedlings interview with Nancy Flinchbaugh. Again, you can find me online at spiritualseedlings.com and read more about Lectio Divina and nature and the other spiritual practices in my new book, Awakening, a contemplative primer on learning to sit.